Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving straight into what we call the unflattening of Black history. Basically, we are going to dismantle that deeply incomplete, compressed, and kind of flattened narrative we've all been handed for way too long. Let's get right into it.
You've probably heard the old saying that history is written by the victors, right? Well, it's absolutely true. The historical record we usually rely on was shaped by people who had a very specific interest in how it came out. Think conquerors, enslavers, and colonial administrators. They had a vested interest in keeping the truth missing or incomplete. I mean, conquerors wrote about the kingdoms they conquered, enslavers wrote about the people they enslaved. It doesn't mean those historical records are completely worthless, but we absolutely have to recognize that the version of events we've been handed was heavily curated by those who benefited from hiding the big picture. Getting that is literally step one to unflattening the past.
Think about the traditional history unit we all got in school. It's usually this incredibly brief segment, right? Just squeezed in somewhere between Thanksgiving and winter break. But when we look at the actual historical record, pieced together by modern research, archaeology, and rich oral traditions, the true picture is vastly longer. It's considerably richer, definitely more tragic in parts, but undeniably more triumphant than what a standard textbook gives you. We're not talking about some isolated, marginalized subtopic here. This is a story that demands a complete reframing of how we even view human civilization. So to really do this right, we have to start at the actual beginning, which is definitely not the middle of the story. Africa is where anatomically modern Homo sapiens first evolved. That means every single human being alive today, no matter where you live or what you look like, traces their ancestry directly back to this continent. Black history isn't just a chapter randomly inserted into the broader human story. It is the opening. Every civilization that followed anywhere on Earth descended from populations that originated right here. And hey, that isn't just some nice inspirational framing, that is the rock-solid scientific consensus across genetics, paleoanthropology, and archaeology today. Just wrap your head around this number for a second. 100,000. For most of the past 100,000 years, African societies existed in an almost incomprehensible range of forms. We're talking about incredibly rich, continuous hunter-gatherer traditions, like the Sand people of southern Africa, who maintained one of the oldest continuously documented ways of life on the planet. And on the flip side, you have these incredibly complex agricultural communities across the Sahel and Great Lakes regions. They were developing highly sophisticated systems for land management, crop cultivation, and animal husbandry way before any external contact. Now, let's talk about the ancient great powers. You always hear about Rome, Persia, and China, right? But there is an entire landscape of monumental global powers in Africa that rarely makes the curriculum. From roughly 3,000 years ago onward, massive states emerged. Take the Aksumite kingdom in present-day Ethiopia. They were an absolute powerhouse, controlling Red Sea trade routes, minting their own coins, and they even adopted Christianity as a state religion in the 4th century. That is centuries before most of Europe did. And even before them, the kingdom of Kush was so powerful that it actually conquered Egypt, giving the ancient world an entire dynasty of Nubian pharaohs whose monuments are literally still standing today. Fast forward a bit to the medieval West African empires, and the scale of wealth is just staggering. For roughly 1,000 years, a succession of empires, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, controlled the massive flow of gold and salt across the Sahara. This generated a level of wealth that made their rulers some of the most powerful political figures on Earth. In 1324, the ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa, went on a famous pilgrimage to Mecca with an entourage of tens of thousands of people. He was carrying so much gold that his spending literally depressed gold prices across the entire Mediterranean economy for more than a decade. Talk about an economic footprint. But the wealth wasn't just material, it was deeply intellectual. Within the Mali Empire, the city of Timbuktu housed one of the absolute greatest centers of Islamic learning in the world. We're talking universities and libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts detailing advanced math, astronomy, law, medicine, and theology. A lot of these actually survive and are still being translated today. And why does this matter so much? Because it completely obliterates the terrible myth that the populations later targeted by the transatlantic slave trade were somehow culturally or politically primitive. They absolutely were not. Which brings us to a harsh, but incredibly essential redefinition. When the transatlantic slave trade kicked off in earnest in the 15th century, the violence unleashed was definitely not a rescue operation or the beginning of civilization for the people it affected, as some deeply flawed historical accounts have tried to suggest. No, it was this systematic destruction on an almost unimaginable scale of complex civilizations that had been developing for thousands of years. It was the deliberate severing of communities, families, and social structures.
And the huge amount of labor extracted from those enslaved people generated the exact agricultural surplus that directly fueled the industrial development of Europe and North America. Let's just pause and really take in this number, 10 to 12 million. That is the estimated number of human beings who survived the horrific ocean crossing over a 400-year period to arrive in the Americas. And that doesn't even count the huge, unknown number of people who tragically died during capture, the march to the coast, or aboard the ships. Spanning from the late 1400s to the mid-1800s, this was the largest forced movement of human beings in history up to that point. When you finally grasp the sheer scale of that displacement, it makes total sense why it completely reshaped global demographics and why we still feel its echoes so deeply in our societies today. Now, what consistently gets underemphasized is how enslaved people actually lived and responded. There's this persistent, frustrating myth of passivity, the idea that people were just victims of historical forces beyond their understanding. But the reality? The reality was constant, unyielding resistance. People made incredibly brave, deliberate choices to preserve their culture, to adapt, and to maintain dignity under conditions specifically designed to make that impossible. Individual acts of self-liberation, flight, and sabotage were happening continuously. They held on to agricultural knowledge, protected kinship structures, and built intricate internal social worlds despite facing extraordinary violence. And sometimes this resistance was highly organized and structural. Take the Haitian Revolution, for instance. It remains one of the most extraordinary political events in all of modern history. A colony of enslaved people systematically overthrew one of the world's actual superpowers, the army of Napoleon Bonaparte. They established the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere in 1804, but the global response was immediate economic isolation. France literally extorted the equivalent of tens of billions of modern dollars in so-called reparations just for the loss of their enslaved labor force. And incredibly, Haiti was forced to make those extortion payments all the way until 1947. Let's jump over to the United States after 1865. The formal abolition of slavery kicked off this amazing period of political possibility during Reconstruction, where Black Americans voted and held high office. Sadly, that was crushed by violent, organized white supremacist campaigns, ushering in the absolute terror of the Jim Crow era. But look at what was built against all odds. Under conditions designed to guarantee failure, Black Americans built incredible, resilient institutions. They founded historically Black colleges and universities. They set up powerful national newspapers like the Chicago Defender. And they fueled the Harlem Renaissance, defining Black identity entirely on their own terms, completely independent of white America's degraded representations. The intellectual caliber of this era was just extraordinary. Take Frederick Douglass in the 1840s. He wasn't just a former slave. He was writing first-order political philosophy, completely dissecting the logic of democratic legitimacy. Then you have Ida B. Wells in the 1890s, who practically invented modern investigative journalism by meticulously documenting lynching, all while facing genuine threats to her own life. And W.E.B. Du Bois, whose framework of double consciousness is still a bedrock of social thought today. These were not minor historical footnotes, folks. They were some of the sharpest political and social minds in Western history, analyzing the failures of American democracy from firsthand experience. And it is absolutely crucial to note that this intellectual and organizational power was profoundly driven by Black women. Too often they get pushed to the sidelines in male-dominated narratives. Think about Harriet Tubman making 19 harrowing missions back into slave territory, or Sojourner Truth navigating both race and gender with formidable rhetorical power. And the Civil Rights Movement, it fundamentally ran on the sustained, day-to-day operational genius of women like Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, and Pauli Murray. You simply cannot recover the full story of Black history without recovering the central organizing power of Black women. This fierce resilience extended right into culture, too, framing art as deep intellectual and political work. Just look at the massive musical bequests to the world: blues, jazz, gospel, soul, funk, R&B, and hip-hop. These foundational American genres didn't just pop up in a vacuum. They were born entirely from the Black American experience, created by communities whose basic humanity was actively being legally contested. Even while being economically exploited and denied copyright, these artists continually produced the cultural vocabulary for the 20th century. Whenever their forms were appropriated, they just invented brilliant new ones. We also have to talk about religion, because it runs through literally every dimension we've covered. During the slave trade, explicit programs of Christian conversion tried to erase African spirituality. But the reality, we saw this incredibly sophisticated theological adaptation. African spirituality merged with Catholicism to create powerful syncretic traditions like Vodou in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, and Santeria in Cuba. These weren't corruptions at all. They were brilliant forms of encoded resistance that preserved African cosmology. In the US, the Black Church became much more than a religious organization. It was the primary institution for political organizing, education, and collective identity that eventually provided the infrastructure for the civil rights movement. Before we bring it all together, let's zoom out geographically for a second. It is super important to understand that the global dispersion of African-descended people started centuries before the transatlantic slave trade. For instance, the Moors, who were largely North and Sub-Saharan African Muslims, influenced the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 800 years, deeply shaping Spanish and Portuguese architecture, language, and culture. And there were thriving Black communities of scholars, soldiers, and traders in medieval Persia, India, and across Southeast Asia. So the whole flattened idea that Africa was geographically isolated until European contact? Not even close to true. It has always been a globally connected story.
Okay, so having looked at the deep origins, the massive empires, the horrific disruption of the slave trade, and that unbroken thread of organizing intellect and culture, we come back to the central question of this explainer. What was Black life actually like through history? Based on the actual historical record, we can break it down into 4 definitive realities.
First, it was ancient. Long before it was anything else, this is the story that begins at the absolute origin of humanity itself. It's the very first chapter from which all other human stories flow. Second, it was powerful. Way before any dispossession happened, it was defined by profound prosperity. We're talking monumental architecture, incredibly advanced trade networks, and a scholarly brilliance that literally shocked the world and shaped the global economy. Third, it was resistant. Through periods of almost incomprehensible violence and systemic subjugation, it demonstrated unyielding courage. There was an incredible organizational sophistication and a continuous collective fight for liberation and basic human dignity. And fourth, it was creative. It is the ongoing dynamic creation of global culture, highly sophisticated faith traditions, and world-class intellectual thought. And remember, this was built specifically under conditions designed to completely prevent those achievements from happening. So I want to leave you with one final question to chew on. How does understanding this 100,000-year unbroken human legacy change how you view the world today? When you unflatten the past, when you finally move beyond just the compressed catastrophic episodes and see the full, vibrant humanity, the complexity, and the sheer triumph of what was built, it kind of rewrites everything, doesn't it? It's one of the longest, most consequential, and genuinely global stories in the entire human record. Thank you so much for walking through this explainer with me today. Keep unflattening your history, and I'll catch you next time.